Welcome to another episode of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Happy Monday, everyone, and happy holiday weekend. Friday, of course, was Canada Day here in Canada, which is Canada's celebration of Confederacy, which dates back to 1867. And, of course, today is July 4th, which is Independence Day in the United States, which celebrates the Declaration of Independence. That was ratified by the Second Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. So, on either end of the weekend, in either country, it truly was a long weekend, and I hope it was a great one for all of you. A few quick announcements as we get going today. Sadly, the Student Agency Institute that was scheduled for Laval, Quebec in October, that has been postponed. If I have any other information about a rescheduling or anything like that, I'll let you know, but for now, that event is not going ahead. Now, this month, we have the annual Conference on Assessment and Grading. That's going to be in Austin, Texas, July 18th through 20th. Along with myself, the conference will feature Cassandra Erkins, Angie Fries, Garnet Hillman, Tony Reibel, Mandy Stalitz, and Katie White. The two-day Grading from the Inside Out training is going to be happening this fall and into the winter as well. Well, not quite into the winter, but Long Beach, California will be September 21st and 22nd. I'll also be in Minneapolis, Minnesota, December 1st and 2nd. So not technically the winter, but it is December. All of the information for those events can be found on the Solution Tree website. Of course, as always, I'll have links in the show notes for them as well. The other conference, of course, that I keep telling you about is the Teach Better Conference. The podcast, of course, is part of the Teach Better Network. That's happening in Akron, Ohio. That'll be October 14th and 15th. Again, a ton of great speakers lined up for that. A link in the show notes for that as well. And if you register using the code SHIMMER22, you'll receive a $25 discount on your registration. Okay, thanks for tuning in again this week. As always, a big welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time, and a big thank you to longtime listeners. I certainly appreciate all of you. This week, my guest is Tyrone McNeil, who is the president of the First Nations Education Steering Committee, or what we call here in BC, FNESC. So we're going to focus on a topic that we really haven't spent a lot of time on this podcast, which is indigenous education. So that's a great conversation with Tyrone. In Assess That with Tom and Nat, Natalie Vardabasso returns, and we're going to talk about some analogies that really help explain certain assessment concepts. So that is today's plan. Let's get to it. My conversation with Tyrone McNeil is coming up. But first, don't at me. But I thought I might open this week on the lighter side and share a little bit about my recent trip to Montreal with my son to see our first ever Formula One race. Now, it is, as I mentioned earlier, a holiday weekend in both Canada and the United States, so I thought maybe this would be a good time to press pause on the whole old man yelling at clouds openers that I often find myself getting into. Look, there'll be lots of time for that, of course, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the experience. The whole F1 experience in Montreal was truly phenomenal, both for the event, but also for me and my son personally. As most of you know, I travel a lot, and both my kids are now adults, so I don't get to spend as much time with them as I once did when they were little. Samantha doesn't live at home anymore, and that makes it more challenging, of course. And Adrian, who still lives at home, finishing his university degree. But of course, with my travel, I don't see him as much. So it's definitely focused me on quality time, not quantity time, with my two kids. Now, during the first year of the pandemic, when I wasn't traveling at all, like so many of you, I had a lot of time for Netflix and Amazon Prime, Apple Plus, all of that. And I still remember back in, I think it was May of 2020, or when we were all watching The Last Dance, right? The Michael Jordan documentary. That, of course, was appointment viewing, and everybody couldn't wait to watch the episodes that came out. Now, as many of you also know, I am an avid podcast listener. I subscribe to probably too many podcasts to sometimes get through, so I often have to just bypass the ones that are daily shows. If I listen to them, that's great, and if I don't, I just delete them and move on to the next day. I tend to prioritize the ones that come out on a weekly basis or a couple times a week or something like that. Now, my favorite podcast is a sports podcast called the Ryan Russillo Podcast. Now, I've been listening to Ryan Russillo since about 2009, 2010, when he was actually on the rise at ESPN, and he had a podcast there back in 2009. He was one of the participants in what was called, at the time, the NBA Today podcast. And I've actually been a pretty loyal listener to Ryan Russillo since then. He's now with Bill Simmons and The Ringer. Anyway, during his podcast a couple of years ago, he kept talking about this Netflix series called Drive to Survive, which chronicled some of the more recent Formula One seasons. Now, for me, growing up, I was never, a car guy or what's sometimes called a gearhead or something like that. I'd watch maybe the Indy 500 or the occasional NASCAR race, but I'd actually often get kind of bored. They're just driving around an oval, and I didn't really know anything about cars, so I just kind of moved on. But Ryan Russillo kept raving about this show called Drive to Survive and how compelling it was. And of course, I had a lot of time on my hands, so I thought, well, I'll take his recommendation and I'll try it out. What have I got to lose, right? I got nothing but time on my hands. So I turned on the first season, which I think was about the 2018 season. And by episode 3, I am completely hooked. Now, for me, it was sort of the drama of the sport. I mean, that's what I love about sports is how real it is, how compelling it is, the competition, all of that. So the drama of it, right? I have a bit of an obsession with watching sports, not all sports, of course, but a lot. And what I loved about the show as I was watching it was essentially 3 things. One was getting to know the drivers personally, right? You know them, and so you become a lot more invested in how things are unfolding. The insight into the competition, right? I love expertise. I know I'm not alone in this, but I love expertise in almost anything. Like watching people who are the very best at anything, whether it's musicians or chefs or athletes. It doesn't matter to me. I love watching people who are expert in something, especially when they are expert in something that is totally outside of my comfort zone. And the third thing I loved about it is it was something that was completely brand new to me. This is something I didn't grow up with. I didn't love. So by the time 2021 rolls around, I started watching the races that were happening, the 2021 season. So I'd finished the Netflix series and I started watching this season as I started to feel fully invested in Formula One. And the 2021 season was so compelling, especially the second half of the season. But it ended with a bit of controversy between Lewis Hamilton of Mercedes and Max Verstappen of Red Bull. So Max became the champion. It was a controversial ending. And now I'm hooked on Formula One. So then I see in November of 2021 that the Canadian Grand Prix is returning, coming back. Since 2019, there has not been a Canadian Grand Prix. So it's coming back to Montreal, and I think, hey, why not? So last November, I bought the tickets, and my son and I went to Montreal for 5 days, June 15th through 20th. And here are some of the things just to kind of give you a feel for that experience and what that was like for us. Here's what I loved. First, it was the energy of race day. Like, it was a sunny day. It was warm. The weather wasn't that great through the whole weekend, but on race day, it was clear blue sky. It was sunshine. It was warm. The crowd was amped. There was a lot of hype. And, some of the seats in the track have a view of a screen where you can see the race, but ours kind of did, but it was a little bit far away because we are on the straight right after the hairpin turn. Now, when you're at the race, you really don't know what's happening on other parts of the track unless you have a view of that screen. And if you're not that close to it, you can't really tell what's happening. So the anticipation of the order, like who passed who and who held off who as they're coming down that front half of the track to the hairpin turn, that was so alluring as the kind of the drivers kind of came into that approach. And as they roared down the approach, we could kind of see them, and the anticipation of the crowd just kept growing and growing. And almost every time they came around the hairpin corner and accelerated down the back stretch, the crowd stood up and watched them head down the back stretch, and we're stretching our necks to try to see if anybody can pass somebody on that straightaway and get their speed going. So the whole experience on race day, yes, it was a lot of people. It was big crowds, but honestly, the energy of it was fabulous. Now, we had a 3-day package, and our seats were the same every single time. So by the end of the 3rd day, you've been sitting beside and around the same people for 3 days. So you kind of get to know them a little bit, which was a lot of fun. Now, the second thing we loved about our experience was the F1 experience. The idea that one thing I didn't realize before I got there was that there's things happening at the track all day long. So when you get to the track, you can watch for a bit. There's smaller car series going on. There's lots of different things happening throughout the course of the day. Obviously, what's happening with the Formula One cars is the highlight and and the feature, but there's so much happening, right? There's an experience when you go to the track. You could spend the full day there and not really watch too much racing, but kind of do a lot of other things, right? You can wander the grounds, you can shop for some F1 swag, and, I promise you, there is a ton of gear for every team available. Fantastic food trucks on site, beverages to be had everywhere. Heineken was the official supplier, but there's also wine, there's cocktails, soft drinks, whatever you want. There's a fan zone that had a number of different experiences in that fan zone, mostly geared toward kids and adolescents, but it was a fun area to be in, tons of energy. Again, the energy was awesome, and people were everyone was so excited to be there. So I love that. And then specifically around the experience, we had purchased an extra package called the F1 Experience. And so this is the third thing I loved. And that included a pit lane walk, a guided track tour, and a photo with the championship trophy. The pit lane walk was really cool because you got to see the cars up front, and you got to actually look into the garages and kind of see what was happening, how the work was going, unfolding. Now, we did the pit lane walk on Saturday night after qualifying. Now, it was supposed to be on Thursday, but an intense thunderstorm kind of canceled Thursday's experiences, so they moved it to Saturday. So during qualifying on Saturday, Sergio Perez, who is a Red Bull driver, crashed his car during qualifying. So when we were walking the pit lane, you could see the mechanics actually working on his car, trying to repair his car, and they got to repair that car all night and have it ready for the race the next day. So that was kind of, not cool for him, but certainly cool for us to kind of see the inner workings of how the garages worked along the pit road. And of course, you could see all the vehicles were all there lined up for everyone to see. Now, the guided track tour, we got on these extended sort of trucks that, had railings, of course, and contained, but they were on the back of a truck, and they drove us around the track, and they were kind of explaining the track and explaining a little bit about each corner and what the drivers had to do. And then, of course, in the end, we had a photo with the championship trophy. Now, we had to leave quickly from that tour because we also had tickets to see an MLS game. So CF Montreal was playing Austin in MLS soccer, which would have been no problem because we would have done the tour on Saturday. But because the tour and everything was moved or would have been, Thursday. But because the tour was moved to Saturday, it meant like we had to get back to the hotel because we had a backpack, and you can't bring backpacks into the soccer game. So back to the hotel in the metro before heading to the stadium. So long story short, we got to the stadium at halftime. So we saw half a game, which was a bit of a bummer because my son and I are also really big soccer fans. But again, another cool stadium experience and something else to do in Montreal. So Saturday was a great day. We just went to the stadium, ate there, did all that we could there. I also appreciated just so many. I think they estimate about 350,000 people attend the event over the weekend. And I so appreciated the efficiency with which people were moved. Clearly, Montreal has done this before because, again, 350,000 people over the weekend. But given that many people, the lines actually move rather quickly, especially the metro lines that kind of run from the island where the circuit is, Gilles Villeneuve circuit. Now, Gilles Villeneuve is a Canadian F1 driver who sadly died in 1982 in Belgium in a race during qualifying at only 32 years old. That track is named after him. His son, Jacques Villeneuve, was a prolific Canadian driver in the late 90s and early 2000s. In fact, he was world champion in 1997. So I knew of him, of course, but I didn't follow F1, and there wasn't as much media about it back then, so I didn't really know. But the way that they moved people in and out from the island to downtown and through the metro was clinical. I couldn't believe how quickly. So I appreciated that because the lines are daunting. There's a lot of people, but man, we got through it quickly. One more thing that I loved about it, the city itself. If you haven't been to Montreal and you ever have a chance to go to Montreal, it is truly a special city. I live in a pretty spectacular metro area as well. Vancouver is one of the most spectacular cities in the world. But I have to tell you, when you go to Montreal, you really do feel like you're somewhere else. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's a French first city. And of course, in Quebec, the first language is French, and they speak French and English. But where I am, of course, in the West, it's pretty much always English first, unless you're in certain parts of Metro Vancouver, but pretty much English first. So the idea of the language alone gave it a different feel. And of course, There's Old Montreal, which is, the closed off streets, the cobblestones, the restaurants, the atmosphere. It is a truly special part of the city and really does add that sort of Euro flair to Montreal. We ate there most of the time. Like I said, we ate at the game on Saturday night, the soccer game. But the whole experience in the city and the way the city itself embraces the Grand Prix it's really clearly something special happening, in the city. Now, the only glitch, here's the one story. The only glitch in the Matrix was Sunday night. I'm a planner, and I know for big events like this, restaurants often get packed. So about a month prior, I made a number of different dinner reservations for my son and I, so we wouldn't be stuck kind of wondering where to eat. Now, we could always change those plans, but I thought if I got these on the books, then we can go from there. So at least, I thought to myself, I'll get this organized, and at least we've got that to go off. And I thought to myself as I was making the reservations, what better way to close out Sunday, race day, than to hit a proper steakhouse to celebrate our trip and our first ever F1 race. So I get on Open Table, I look for a Sunday night reservation, I find one at a highly rated steakhouse in Montreal, 7:30 reservation, we're flying home the next day, that's how we do it, this is going to be epic. So Sunday night after the race, we walk to the restaurant, ready for a great meal, and the doors are locked. And no one's in the restaurant. I looked at the sign next to the door. They're closed on Sundays. So somehow Open Table let me make a reservation for a restaurant. And I had the reservation. They let me make a reservation for a restaurant that is closed on Sundays. So not so good. But we rallied. We found a little French restaurant, casual kind of French restaurant in Old Montreal. We ate outside. We were people watching, a couple of cocktails, and we capped off a great trip. For me, tapping into a new sport has really been fun. And, I've since found out that so many other people I know are not only into F1, but they've been watching it for decades. And I'm like, I had no idea. I don't really know much about cars, as I said, but I love watching competition. And now I'm in the learning phase to try to understand the sport with more specificity. I listen to a couple of podcasts that are weekly podcasts about F1 because it's helping me kind of learn, and I love that. I am an F1 fan solely because of Netflix. As we chatted with people at restaurants, my son and I actually met a couple at an Irish pub we were at who go to 1 to 2 races every year. And it's funny because they've been fans for a long time, and they appreciated the fact that we fully admitted to being fans because of Netflix. Apparently, people who've watched Netflix try to pretend like they've been fans for a whole life. I don't know why people do that, but they do apparently. Some people we met weren't happy that the crowds were bigger than they've ever been, and they blame Netflix for that. But honestly, the sport has never been more popular, and it seems to be on the rise here in North America. Now, Austin and Montreal have been on the calendar for years, but now there's also an F1 race in Miami. Las Vegas is coming, I think, in November of 2023. So F1 seems to be expanding its presence in North America. So it'll be kind of cool. There'll be a race in the East in Miami, also in Montreal. There'll be a race in Austin, kind of the central part of the country of the United States. And then there'll be a Western race in Las Vegas. So that's kind of cool. I mean, I probably will never love F1 the way I love some other sports, but I have to tell you, tapping into this unfamiliar world has been like a burst of energy to my sports viewing activities. Like every sport, it's the competitors, it's the storylines, it's the drama that make it so compelling. I know it's not for everyone, but if you haven't watched Drive to Survive on Netflix, I dare you. I dare you to watch it, because I promise you, you will emerge with at least more interest or more understanding of F1 than you did before. Now, maybe you won't become a fan, sure, but you'll be more familiar with something that is so massive right now that I really had no idea was that big. It was an amazing experience, and certainly this won't be the last race we attend, that's for sure. But most importantly, it was a shared experience with my son that I will never forget. Joining me today is Tribal Chief Tyrone McNeil. Tyrone is Stalo and a member of the Seabird Island Band. He has extensive experience working to advance First Nations languages, education, collaborating with First Nations across the country, and developing agreements and partnerships with the government. He holds numerous leadership positions, listeners. He is Vice President and Tribal Chief of the Stalo Tribal Council. He's the President of the First Nations Education Steering Committee, the Assembly of First Nations Chiefs Committee on Education. He's the representative from British Columbia, the chair of the Emergency Planning Secretariat, chair of Seabird College, president of Seabird Development Corporation, and the standing chair of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So clearly, listeners, you know exactly where this conversation is going today. Tyrone, you have an incredible number of titles and leadership positions. I want to welcome you to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Looking forward to our conversation. I'm glad we could make this happen. Now, before we dig into our conversation, which is clearly going to focus in on the education of our Indigenous youth here in British Columbia and across Canada and quite literally around the world, I do want listeners to have a little bit more about your background. So before we dig into the substance of that conversation, let's talk a little bit about you. Maybe talk about your background professionally. What is your background? And why the gravitation toward education? Why so much involvement in the education field?
Well, professionally, out of all the hats I wear, Tom, I think that the only one that'll approach the professional side is manager of a First Nations owned civil construction company. That's really my paying day job. We have about 80 employees, the majority are First Nations. We have non-First Nations, which is fine, but we're about First Nations, right? And
Right.
we've transitioned over the years from job creation to career development. And by career development, I mean stable, high-paying jobs. I got a number of my crew are actually building houses, paying for it out of their pocket, Tom. Not a low subsidy housing, but paying a mortgage out of their pocket. So it is
Right.
really about career development.
Mm-hmm. So that's your day job, and that's what pays the bills and supports your family. But you have such a heavy involvement in education. So what drew you to, again, being, we're going to talk about FNESC in a moment,
Mm-hmm.
but just your involvement with education. Where did that sort of stem from?
It started specifically in 1999, Tom. I got elected onto the Seabirds Band Council, and we've had a very stable governance right from the get-go. So in that election, I was the only new member elected into 8 council members and a chief.
Mm-hmm.
And this is 1999, and back then, folks didn't necessarily look at education as a priority. There's so many other priorities that chiefs and council are responsible for. So
Right.
it just so happens that the rookie on council got this thing called an education portfolio. And although I was aware of education, partly involved and whatnot, I didn't wasn't aware of what was all involved. So taking it on as a portfolio, being in our school here in Seabird on nearly a daily basis, the public schools, the school board office, it just sparked a passion in me, Tom. I seen it as the number one vehicle for moving and transitioning our entire population from a population based on dependency from the Indian Act to empowerment to self-determination. And we can't advance ourselves professionally, career-wise, financially with better paying jobs if we don't have a better education, a higher education. So literally, right from day one on a job as education portfolio, it bit me really deep, Tom. And then over time, I found as more and more people were like-minded and engaging in some really powerful conversations. So I just found myself to be, although I was new to it, a really good fit, and I still enjoy it here in 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that as educators as well, we know that that foundation for children and adolescents and youth as they grow into adulthood, that foundation of education really is the key to success and a lifelong of success. Let's talk a little bit again, just to give listeners, listeners from British Columbia will know the First Nations Education Steering Committee, or FNESC. But for listeners who are outside of British Columbia or even outside of Canada, can you just give us an overview of what is FNESC and what is the mission of that organization?
The Finessing is a First Nations technical organization working with and supporting, and in some cases representing and advocating for the 203 First Nation communities here in the province. And within those communities, we've got 130 schools on reserve, mostly primary, about 30 go up to grade 12. We've got 37 post-secondary institutes on reserve that we work with, support, and advocate for as well.
Mhm.
So we've got a political, although we're technical, we do have a political protocol. In BC, where First Nations are really well versed in finding ways to come together in key areas like education, child welfare, forestry, mining, whatnot. So in that are three political bodies: the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the First Nations Summit, and the BC Assembly of First Nations. Their executive comes together and are known as the First Nations Leadership Council. That's our most senior First Nations leadership in the province, and we have a protocol with them, like others do. But in our case, our protocol states that we're the lead advocacy body for First Nations lifelong learning here in British Columbia.
Mhm. So let's pivot now and talk about the education of Indigenous youth and children, and talk about some specifics. Now we're going to get to the other side of this coin momentarily, but I want to begin with what currently has you feeling the proudest in terms of what's happened so far, or what has you feeling the most optimistic going forward about how Indigenous children and youth in BC are being educated and how they're being supported. What has you sort of really feeling positive at this point?
One of the things make me feel positive and comes back to the organization's mission and mandate and whatnot around starting with Indian control of Indian education, parental involvement, local control, and whatnot. We've wrapped that up into a really comprehensive tripartite agreement between FNESC, British Columbia, and Canada called the BC Tripartite Education Agreement. In there, we're really explicit on the flow of funding in key program areas. A big chunk of that funding comes to us as an organization, and we work with communities on a methodology for distributing throughout the province, whether they're school-based, community-based, institute-based.
Mhm.
And what we're doing in such a coordinated fashion, it's virtually seamless, Tom. I've got 130 board members, and we get together quarterly. We have stacked agendas, 4 inches binders of information, and we find ways to be on the same page on virtually every issue that comes before us, whether
Mhm.
it's something we're new and starting off from scratch, or ultimately the provincial or federal government might be posing something we don't agree with, and we come up with a response to the strategy and attack that is voted on unanimously, and then we advance it that way. And then directly related to that, Tom, is like the moving of the agenda for First Nations education here in BC. I was just attended a BC School Trustees AGA last month, and that they, as an organization, as a major stakeholder in education here in BC, they've shifted considerably over
Mhm.
the last 8 years, Tom. I
Yeah.
can remember being invited to their AGA in 2016, and the first words out of my mouth in a room full of trustees and superintendents and ministry officials, Tom, is some of you here in this room are racist.
Mm.
And a number of them were right. And after I finished talking, and a number came up to me, thanked me for identifying the elephant in the room. So we being the BC School Trustees Association, Tom, have moved from me making that comment in 2016 to being invited to the AGA last month, where they spent 2 full days with First Nations elders doing some cross-cultural training and sharing with their room full of trustees that were fully attentive, fully engaged, and fully appreciative of being educated like that. So
Mhm.
that's a major shift in the system, right? And the trustees are a big piece of the education system. We need more other stakeholders embracing us like that too. But that's really something to celebrate, Tom. When you
Yeah.
have a room full of trustees being happy to be educated by First Nations elders for 2 days, it's amazing.
Wow, that is amazing. Two things I want to follow up with in your answer there. First, um, let's start with one of the first things you said. Everybody being on the same page is almost unheard of in any situation or any circumstance. How did that happen? How did where did you find your way to that level of alignment within the organizations that are trying to work together?
But we find, in my case, it's education, but it applies to other sectors as well, where we're all under certain pressures, whether we're not receiving the funding required to do what we're doing, or there's
Mhm.
policies and policy frameworks that don't recognize us or lack our worldview. So we come from a pretty standard position of oppression, right? So
Hmm.
for education, it was a lack of funding from federal government. They wouldn't fund us comparably to the provincial government. The Ministry of Education and school boards making decisions that didn't include us. That was standard right across the province, right?
Right.
So when we met together, we talked about, okay, we're tired of being treated that way. How do we want to change it? And we've got some excellent staff, Tom. I got a great team of staff supporting me, and
Hmm.
particularly my executive director, Deb Jeffrey. And we have a number of staff like here where there are teachers in the past, there are trustees in the past, there are lawyers, they're well-rounded folks, citizens, and they're here working for me within the organization. So,
Hmm.
what an issue is before us, and staff get together, frame out some suggested responses or options, bring it up to the board level, have dialogue. Like everybody's included, Tom.
Yeah.
And quite often we get pressure from provincial and federal government on the amount of money it takes for us to bring a board together. Or we have regional sessions where we've broken the province down to 9 different regions, and we're out there up to 6 times a year in each region talking about local education agreements, curriculum, language and culture, graduation, those kind of things. So
Hmm.
for me in education, the number one reason for us being on the same page is we're so inclusive. A
Hmm.
130 member board is pretty representative of the province. We get out into the regions, into communities on a regular basis to hear from, and I'm never surprised, Tom, at the excellent suggestions that come from the ground. Those folks were literally on the ground and in classrooms that we wouldn't even have thought of, but we raise something with them, they respond that way, and then we have the ability to raise that to be our province-wide mandate in that area. So it's that inclusivity, the flexibility, the communications that allows us to be on the same page.
Yeah, I love that. The one other follow up to what you were saying there, and maybe if you would just very briefly for listeners outside of British Columbia, when I travel around the United States and Canada and other places, and I talk about some of the structures we have in place, and I don't mean to suggest they are by in any means perfect, but when I describe for them the enhancement agreements, the memorandums of understanding we have within school districts, could you describe that for listeners outside of BC? Help them understand some of the structures that have been put in place, the enhancement agreements, as I say, the memos of understanding, the things that exist to support Indigenous learners, whether they be on reserve or whether they be in a public school system. Could you give us a brief description of that so people understand a little bit of what you've been referring to?
Sure, and that's actually a big piece of the work that we do in the backgrounds, Tom,
Right.
where depending on the relation a local First Nation has with a school district, and a school district could have 1, 2, 15, 20 different First Nations communities within the school district bounds, that
Mhm.
they if the relation is lacking, typically you have an enhancement agreement, something just to set the table to develop a relationship. So one of the most important relations we have between our First Nations and local school boards and trustees is what we call a legally binding contractual relation called a local education agreement. In there, it allows the First Nations to identify their priorities, their relation to the school board, to the schools in support of their kids, and it's about communications, data sharing, whatnot. So we as an organization do in my view, biased view, Tom, a really good job of creating templates for
Mhm.
communities to pick up. And a good chunk of the work is there, the structure is there, the language is there, and they modify it to the local community needs, local capacity needs, be more reflective of the relation that they have with the school boards.
Mhm.
So it's moving from what typically were fairly soft, kind of good commitment, good sounding agreements around enhancement and MOUs to a contractual agreement. And it's pretty significant, and it is appropriate because in that LEA, it gives us a chance to talk to school boards in a quasi government to government relation, Tom. So we're
Yeah.
not stewards of the system; we're rights holders, and the LEAs do a good job of describing that.
So one of the duties I had in Penticton was around Indigenous education and the fascinating work with the enhancement agreements and the layers of understanding. It was definitely a steep learning curve in that. Now I want to go back to one more thing you said, Tyrone. I'm trying to envision you in 2016 standing in the middle of a meeting of provincial trustees and making this assertion. And can you walk me through what the next few hours or the next few days of that kind of looked like? I can imagine the types of reactions you must have had in the room when you stand up and you say all of you or most of you in this room are racist. How did you navigate? How did the group navigate through those hours or those couple of days when you were together? Just maybe give us some insight as to how that played out. That obviously was a breakthrough in relations. We had to shock the system a little bit, didn't you? So let's go ahead and walk us through that.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, to begin with, my statement is some of you in this room are racist.
Okay, fair enough.
Because we know and the ministry knows that there's some school districts within the province that they put it nicely, Tom. They challenge us. The First Nations graduation rate in some districts is as low as 12%. And that's not acceptable. And to be completely disregarded like that is nothing but racist.
Right.
So keep in mind that the trustees AGA was in alignment with my provincial education conference, where we bring 1,000 people together every year and talk about the priorities in education. So just because it takes a lot to get me to say that in front of a group like that, Tom. And but it shows you our relation with some school boards at the time. So I signaled back to my team, I'm going to hang out here for a little while because I can't just say that and walk out, right? So I sat there for a couple of hours, and a large number of trustees came up to me and just thanked me for putting the elephant on the room. They know what they see amongst their peers across the province, but as an association, they really can't do anything. They can't penalize or scold a board or anything like that.
Right.
But just the fact that they owned it. Nobody said I'm a liar, it's not true or anything like that. But I think they as an association struggled with how do we manage that as an association. So kudos on the executive leadership of the trustees. They really owned it. They did their own work to transition them as an organization from me making that statement to spending 2 days with their elders. So really, it was the executive leadership of the organization that I thank and recognize for that, Tom. Because there are a lot of trustees throughout the province and a lot of folks with different thoughts, different mindsets. So a lot of them are wide open and accepting of us, and some are closed and not accepting of us. But the executive leadership took the appropriate role and took the association to a much better place. And I know it wouldn't have been easy. Their internal discussion would have been a lot more open, I'm sure, than a public meeting, but they did it, and I really appreciate it with that hard work.
For me, that is the epitome of speaking truth to power, and obviously it paid dividends in terms of the work that's happened since then. And leadership requires courage, and Tyrone, clearly you were showing tremendous leadership in that moment. Now let's go to the flip side. We know that we have in BC made tremendous strides in terms of how we support Indigenous learners, but by no means is it perfect. So what still has you feeling a little bit frustrated, or dare I say, pessimistic about some things in the way that and I don't know that you're feeling that, but what is it that you're still feeling frustrated about in terms of how we support Indigenous learners here in BC?
That definitely concerns about Indigenous learners, Tom, but also about the larger education system itself.
Okay, fair enough.
It was around 2015 when public post-secondary institutes came up to us in one of our regular meetings that we had with them. And they informed us that 92% of all BC Dogwood graduates, that's not just us, that's all Dogwood graduates, are illiterate to step into post-secondary studies. So they, as post-secondary institutes, have to bring up the students' literacy levels to take on certain degrees and programming, whatnot. So that it makes me really nervous, Tom. And if you think as a system, the struggling there a bit is a nice way to put it, I'd say. That we're always on the bottom end of every socioeconomic indicator. So if the system is feeling that pain, it's compounded on us.
Right.
So it just needs a added attention, more light shed on our students, whether it be the success of our students or the lack of success of our students. But what does keep me going there, Tom, is that we know school boards are trying hard, and they're doing new and innovative things, and they're leading to really good success rates for our kids. They're being courageous themselves, Tom. Like, I was on a call this morning with the indigenous district leads throughout the province here. A number of them were sharing how they, as a district, taking it on themselves to not offer English 10, for example,
Hmm.
because years ago we worked with the province and we came up with an English First Peoples 10
Hmm.
that's academically equivalent to English 10. But it's based on our literature, our worldview, our authors and whatnot. So if you want to graduate in that district, your grade 10 English is about us.
Hmm.
So it's those incremental steps like that that, we need to recognize more of that good work taking place in the province and use that as a demonstration that it can be done with a willing partner to encourage those boards that are historically a little bit less willing.
Yeah, the English First Peoples curriculum to me was a tremendous breakthrough here in British Columbia, and really just it was almost hitting the reset button about what is quality literature, what is language, how do we teach it, how do we teach it through, uh, you know, uh, how do we create opportunities for not just indigenous learners but for non-indigenous learners to have the opportunity to learn through language and culture within English First Peoples too, which is also a byproduct of that course. So I absolutely loved that. Now, Tyrone, I think I would be derelict in my duties here if we did not talk about, from an education perspective, we did not talk about residential schools and the residential school issue. And of course, it was just over a year ago in May of 2021 when the remains of 215 children were found in Kamloops at the site of a former residential school. And I think we all know that this is not going to be the last time a discovery like this is made. I know there is no way to truly sort of get over or move past the legacy of residential schools in Canada. The intergenerational effects alone will never truly be reconciled. And I'm not even sure I really have a question here, and I'm trying to ask this artfully, as artfully as I can. I'm thinking about the pathway forward. Um, Knowing that what happened in Kamloops last year was not a one-off, how do we, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, grapple with the horrors of the past as we try to find our way forward in coming to terms? Because we know, as I said, what happened last year is likely to repeat itself. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how do we together grapple with the horrors of the past?
There's a few things happening since Kamloops became public, Tom. One is a more of awareness by British Columbians, sorry, Canadians, of what actually happened in residential schools. Because
Mhm.
a lot of British Columbians, a lot of Canadians that I talked to over the years think we're lying when talking about the atrocities in residential schools. But now, when they're hearing on the news that there's bodies of children, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years old,
Yeah.
being found in unmarked graves, it's really hitting them hard in the hearts, Tom. It's opening up their hearts in ways that we never could in the past. Um, and it absolutely relate to that because children of any race are important, right? They're valued, they're loved and whatnot. And I think it's taking that to have a lot of British Columbians, a lot of Canadians kind of step back a little bit and start looking. Oh, gee, now I kind of get why you see so many First Nations on skid rows in cities and whatnot. So impoverished First Nations across the country and whatnot. Because it's a history that was imposed on us. It
Yeah.
wasn't optional, it was imposed. So Canadians are just now starting to understand that. And we'd like to leverage that passion to make inroads in more awareness. In BC, we've worked with the province and education stakeholders. We've come up with Indian residential school curriculum and that could be taught in public schools. We've come up with teacher resource guides for teachers that don't know us, but they need a little bit of support to be able to teach curriculum on residential schools. But the uptake on it over the years is pretty low, Tom, or
Yeah.
not as high as we'd like. So now, really hoping that with more of this awareness out there, more teachers would go, gee, maybe I should learn more about this, and gee, maybe I should be teaching my students about it as well. because that it's that education aspect of it that all we ask for is a level playing field, because right now it's not level for us. We're looked down on, and with zero understanding of why we're at the bottom end of so many socioeconomic indicators. So on one regard, it's really softened the approach of many British Columbians, many of those in the education system and other systems as well. So as sad and as it's hard to respond to unmarked graves being discovered like that, Tom. And as a leader, as a father, as a grandfather, but just all we can do is step back, is send our prayers that way, and hope communities like Kamloops and come to grips with it and do what they need to finally process it themselves. But what I'm worried about, Tom, is as hard as that is mentally and spiritually and physically on us and a lot of other British Columbians and Canadians, this is compounded on top of 2 years of COVID. So that added mental stress, that added mental harm that every one of us have been going through, and not being able to meet with their family and friends on a regular basis. It is getting better now, but we have a ways to go to rekindle those relations.
Mm-hmm.
So when folks are asking, what could we learn from, what could we do as a result of Kamloops, and all I could say is, be compassionate, feel empathy towards us, but be willing to work with us.
Yeah.
And knowing that we're not going to use that as a crutch or a sledgehammer. It's just our reality, Tom. It's a really sad, hard pill to swallow reality, but help us overcome it. And coming back to education, in my view, is the best vehicle to overcome that. So let's continue to make some significant changes in education, not only to support the successes and academic achievements of our kids, but continue educating British Columbians and Canadians on that history in the appropriate way. It's not a crutch, it's not a sledgehammer, but it's a reality. And I feel really strongly, Tom, that when we do that in an effective, productive way, it's going to take away a lot of this indifference, bias, and racism that British Columbians and Canadians feel against First Nations. It's so natural in the Canadian fabric to be indifferent or racist towards us. Well, now it's an opportunity. Let's overcome that for the betterment of First Nations, the betterment of Canadians, and for the betterment of us as a country as a whole.
Do you think it the denial, the defensiveness, et cetera? Do you think it is? And I know I can't cast everyone as a monolith in one group, but do you think it is that British Columbians, Canadians take the assertions too personally, in that the things that have happened in the past and the assertions about racism and the atrocities of residential schools? Is it that Canadians in modern society are taking that too personally and taking it as an individual affront rather than seeing it as a systemic thing? Is that where from your perspective, is that where part of the challenge is coming from?
I think the what you're describing as a challenge, Tom, is become more in the public domain over the last 20 years, particularly via social media.
Right.
If you go back to the 1990s and prior to that, Canadians would have no idea we even existed. It's
Right.
like a lot of school boards wouldn't even know which First Nations are within their districts and whatnot. And we was being seen as nothing but wards of the state.
Yeah.
And the Indian Act makes us that, right? It
Right.
impoverishes us. It puts us in a position that disempowers us, that we have to go to the federal government for anything and everything. And just think, Tom, it was only about 60 years ago where our leadership of the day, our chiefs and councils, couldn't make a decision without an Indian agent's signature to a decision.
Right.
So that paternalistic and that's not that long ago, yet we've come so far since.
Right.
So it's been a struggle, and we've had willing partners in the education system right in the early days as well, but there hasn't been enough of them.
Right.
There hasn't
Well,
been enough understanding by the general public, and you see it play out in trustee elections, where trustees tend to be pretty demonstrative of the population within the school district.
right.
And
Right.
if the population within the school district are don't know about us, they're ignorant about us, or they're indifferent or biased, the trustees are going to be that very thing, Tom.
Right.
So the more awareness out there, that I think over time, that you'll see a shift in some of those school boards that have been such a problem for generations, that their eyes open a little bit differently tomorrow. They start thinking a little bit differently. They feel some empathy, and they're willing to do a little bit more for us. Not do everything for us, but do more things with us. Is
Yeah.
that'd be pretty significant.
Yeah, to advocate for the changes that are necessary. Certainly, uh, I think it's very true. We have come a long way, but at the same time, we have a long way to go in terms of what's needed. So, with advocacy, I want to shift back to thinking about the future. With any kind of advocacy, there's always a set of goals or a desirable outcome. So, as you think about the education of Indigenous children and youth in British Columbia, what is the desirable or ultimate what is the vision for you from your perspective? I know that there are many voices and many people have slightly different perspectives, and I know you don't speak for everybody, but from your perspective, you know what would have you saying we finally did it, like we finally have, even if it's a pipe dream, like what is it that what is that desirable outcome? This is how our Indigenous children and youth should have been educated all along. What would have you saying that? What's the vision?
For me, what I see at the I don't want to say end of the tunnel, Tom, but what I see down the road is our education outcomes continue to improve, that we're graduating at least the same as the rest of British Columbians, if not better,
Mhm.
that then we're advancing into professional positions where we have more of our teachers in classrooms, more of our principals, superintendents, and whatnot, special needs teachers, the professionals in the system.
Right.
But beyond that, we're engaged in civic elections. We're participating directly in local governments. Where more of us are elected in the provincial governments and whatnot. So
Mhm.
we're incorporated more in the British Columbia society writ large.
Mhm.
And to do that, we need a really well-educated population. So that's really what I see in my mind, Tom. And there's a lot of things that other successes along the way, whether they be improved employment rates and improving the wages of those that are employed, going on to professional careers and whatnot. Knowing it's not for everybody, but those that seek trades, there's more journeyman trades out there doing really good work, and they're really happy in their careers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, for me, when I look out there and see people working, I really look for the people that are passionate about what they're doing. They enjoy what they're doing. So
Mhm.
it's not all about the highest wages, Tom. It's about building skills to allow people to enjoy what they're passionate about, at whatever that might be, at any level. And that's what success is for me, Thomas,
Mhm.
when we're meeting the learning needs of individuals. Well, we're not talking about a stat for the 7,500 First Nations in public schools or the 5,000 in our schools. We're talking about individual successes. And it takes a lot of work to get there,
For
but it's
sure.
so rewarding when we see those smiling faces, that, people enjoy what they're doing. There's not a job, but they happen to get paid for it. They love it.
I love it.
That would be ideal for me, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean that would be a tremendous accomplishment, and certainly something worth striving for and advocating for, and making sure that all of our learners, Indigenous learners, are set up for success, a life of success, financial security, passion for the work they're following and leading, and all of that just absolutely would be a tremendous accomplishment for sure. So let's finish up by widening our view a little bit. I want you to, because I know, Tyrone, that you have interactions with other organizations across Canada and maybe into the United States and around the world. I'm not sure. We know that political boundaries are a sort of Eurocentric idea, and we know that nations cross borders all the time. So
Mhm.
I'm thinking about when you look across Canada or you look into the United States, and you think about another model or another jurisdiction, how they are supporting Indigenous learners, Indigenous education. Is there anything that you see across Canada or into the United States that you're maybe a little envious of, or you think we should replicate that, or that's something we should do here in British Columbia? Is there a model out there, or is there an aspect of that model out there that you think would be really helpful here in British Columbia?
First of all, the model we built here in BC, we've looked at other jurisdictions, we've learned from them, we've borrowed from them, we invited them here to present to us on it. So the one of the uniquenesses about our model here in BC is we've got the systems model in place, we've got
Hmm.
the structures model in place,
Yeah.
but we wouldn't advance it without an appropriate funding methodology to support it.
Hmm.
So when I look at other models across Canada, I see some really good structures, some really good systems, but they don't have the necessary funding to do what's intended in their agreement. So
Hmm.
we and it's not to put down anybody. It's just their strategy, their tactic. Well, this is ours.
Okay.
On the K to 12 side, I want to be careful how I say this, Tom, but a lot of people tell us that we're the organization for First Nations education
Hmm.
and in Canada. But on the post-secondary side, in particular, what some of our counterparts and the United States are doing is just tremendous. Where they've got their own accredited post-secondary institutes with thousands of students putting on all kinds of degree programs. And mind you, one of their communities might be, 15,000 citizens alone, whereas in BC, and it's one of our number one challenges, Tom, so many of our communities are so small.
Right.
So that compels us to come together and aggregate and build out from there. So from that, it'd be ideal to take a U.S. tribes model and start talking about that here. And we are at the early stages of building a made in BC for BC First Nations post-secondary model, and we'll be definitely looking at models such as that. And then one of the areas that we have to roll up our sleeves and do more work on is on the early childhood development, early childhood education aspect of things now,
Hmm.
particularly now with the Ministry of Education taking over the authority for those early years.
Hmm.
Now we have to, cast their web out. What are other jurisdictions doing around early childhood, knowing that there's a play-based aspect to it and an early years education aspect to it, and they're two important factors. Not one can't trump the other or usurp the other. There's room and space for both, and in my experience, Tom, that compels me to talk to folks about a hybrid model or transitioning those early years into grade one in particular.
Yeah.
Where if you're talking about early years program and early childhood educators who aren't certified teachers, or talking to certified teachers in kindergarten that aren't early childhood education teachers, we need a hybrid teacher certification that takes the best of those and best positions children to step into grade one at a grade one or higher level and hit the ground running.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I was not aware of the post-secondary institutions in the United States. It sounds like there's some cross-country conversations where I was kind of hoping you would say that about BC's model, because I do know that BC is often looked to, but I just wondered about other jurisdictions. But it sounds like for K-12 education, in terms of including the funding, that BC may be the model to look to. But the cross conversation about post-secondary, but you're right to point out the population issue. I think that's something that Canada itself deals with, which is having such a much smaller population.
Mhm.
Therefore, the institutions just can't sustain themselves. But um, a question about that is there. Are there agreements? Because we know that when students from Canada attend United States universities, there is an international tuition that is charged to those students. But I'm wondering, is that something that is the same if an Indigenous learner from Canada wanted to attend an Indigenous university in the United States? Is there a different kind of agreement financially, or is there a way that students can attend those schools in the United States without having to face the same sort of international kinds of fees or tuition? I admit to being ignorant about the topic, so I'd be interested and curious to know how that sort of plays out.
Well, we've got a number of our students attending post-secondary institutes internationally, Tom, whether
Okay.
it's the United States, Britain, France, Italy, like that. Sometimes I'm shocked. Even one of my members here from Seabird gets a degree out of the university in Italy, and they show up at our community awards. We
Hmm.
don't even recognize them because we haven't seen them for years, but they found a way to do it.
Yeah.
And a piece of it is our ability to financially support them. We do have
Okay.
limited funds.
Yeah.
It'll be a community's choice. Do they fund a student to go to an institute in the United States or even Alberta or Ontario
Mm-hmm.
or London, for example? So a piece of that is the local community's priority and their ability to move
Right.
funds around. And see, that's the reason we're building a post-secondary model here, because right now we do know our system is underfunded,
Hmm.
that communities have to cherry pick who to support and who they don't have enough resources to support. And many of those same communities are finding their own revenue, own source revenue, and putting that towards post-secondary studies as well.
Hmm.
So it's safe to say that we don't necessarily have the same barriers of other British Columbians or Canadians in attending those international institutes, but it ends up being a financial burden, and whether we have the ability to support them
Right.
financially or not.
Right.
And then at the same time, those students are working one and two jobs to, to get their own money to pay for the fees
Right.
and room and board and whatnot as well. So it's not like they're relying totally on our post-secondary funding. They're
Mhm.
doing what they can as well.
Yeah, for sure. So wonderful, Tyrone. This has been a fascinating conversation, and certainly I know that I'm going to listen back to this myself several times. I really appreciate it. So let's two questions left. Let's finish up here as we close out. These are two questions, Tyrone, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. They're two general questions. You can take them in any direction you want to. The first question, again, take it where you want. Educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
In terms of education, it's about never giving up,
Hmm.
never be too frustrated, never be too angry, never take too hard a line, or at least limit the hard lines, because occasionally we do. So in that regard, what keeps me up at night sometimes is who's across the table that might be preventing us from advancing, preventing us from improving the outcomes of our students, and whether it's something as large as a Ministry of Education, or you go down a layer to school boards, and it's actually that relation between the Ministry of Education and school boards that does keep me up at night,
Hmm.
Tom,
Yeah.
because the ministry is empowered the school boards to be, for the most part, autonomous. But I continually tell a ministry, you can delegate any and all authority that you see fit to school boards, except ours. So ministry, we need you to come in and support us at the school board level when we ask you to, and the school boards need to be open to that. So it's that piece, Tom, that we need to figure out is how do we have the ministry hold school boards, trustees accountable in terms of our priorities, that allows us to improve. And really, that's all we're asking for is provisions to improve the outcomes of our kids.
Right.
So, and I don't necessarily call that a jurisdictional divide or jurisdictional space. It's a delegated authority from the ministry to school boards, and we need to look at that differently. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, Tom, that when we bro- broker whatever that is to better suit our needs, that other British Columbians might look at it and go, geez, we want to be a little more engaged through and have supports for the ministry rather than our local school boards as well. So it might be an opportunity to take a look at the education system and do a little bit of redesign it. A really well thought out, thoughtful, strategic process, but it's that bit of a narrative that
Yeah.
I wake up at 2 at night. Oh, maybe we should try this, or have we tried that kind of thing.
That's
Mhm,
understandable for sure. That would
mhm.
keep you up at night for sure. That's a big one. Last question as we finish up, Tyrone. Generic question about success. If a random person stopped you on the street and said, "What's your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
My definition of success is seen and felt in all aspects of living here in British Columbia. Whether I'm attending a post-secondary institute or I'm walking into a supermarket or a mall, where right now, if I walk into a store, Tom, chances are somebody gets up and they stay 10 feet behind me for the entire time I'm in that store. That's that racist behavior of the store because they don't know us, right?
Right.
So over time, we've modified the education of everybody here in British Columbia, so that they know us better, that racism is diminished. It'll never be completely gone, but diminished. So success is being reflective and being felt like as a part of the British Columbia fabric.
Hmm.
And at the same time, our graduation rates have increased. And I got two grandsons, Tom. They're 5 and 6 years old. They're in the education system, and success for me is for those two boys graduating with dogwoods or better, stepping directly into post-secondary institutes, completing advanced degrees, and in that whole education life for them, They see themselves reflected in the education curriculum. They see themselves reflected in instructors that are in front of the classrooms, and if they feel welcomed and warmly by their peers, because their peers know who they are as two young Stalo boys right now, growing up wanting to advance themselves. So, and I don't want to call it holistic necessarily, Tom, but it kind of relates to that, where it's a broad welcoming by this education system itself, being reflected in the curriculum, being taught by culturally appropriate teachers and instructors along the way. And that's what success for me. And it is at that personal level, because I love my boys, Tom, and I want nothing but for the best for them in the
Yeah.
future.
Absolutely. That would be the epitome of success for sure. Listeners, you can follow Tyrone on Twitter. The handle is at STC Ty, so STCTYE. And Tyrone is also on LinkedIn. I'll have links in the show notes for both of those accounts so you can connect with Tyrone. Tyrone, this was a fantastic conversation today. I really, really appreciate you doing this. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Okay, assess that with Tom and Nat. Welcome back, Natalie. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tom. Always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. And last time we were chatting about negotiables, non-negotiables, where we have some choices of flexibility. We ended our session talking a little bit about analogies. And so we suggested we pick up the conversation with some analogies. So let me throw it to you. And where do you want to start today?
Well, I told you last time where I want to start. I heard a tale. I believe it was from Shannon Shingles, a shout out, that you have a fantastic pancake analogy that just gets the people going. So
gets the people going.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to throw it right back to you.
Okay, I'll throw it. All right. I can start there then. That's fine. Yeah, the whole, let me give the backstory on it, and then I'll give the analogy. A lot of times I will introduce this analogy to people when I'm talking about academic rigor and talking about assessment from this perspective. Assessment, as far as assessing your standards or your outcomes by topic, that's something teachers don't really need a lot of support with. Like, you'd almost have to go out of your way to not cover your standards by topic. The question really comes down to the cognitive rigor. Am I assessing my standards or my outcomes at the appropriate cognitive complexity? And am I getting to the right depth of thinking? And the key is, am I making sure that evidence that falls under that, the underpinnings, don't really contribute to grade determination? So I basically start off by describing it. So I'll describe the analogy as if I were describing it in a workshop. And I think, listeners, you've probably heard me allude to this a few times on previous episodes, but I'll try to quickly give you what the analogy is. So, and what I do when I give this analogy is I often mix the language purposefully. I tell participants in the workshops that just say, look, I'm going to mix education language with language of cooking. It's going to get a little clunky, but I'm trying to drop some hints as I go through it. Okay, so it begins by saying, I'm going to describe for you the process of making pancakes. So, and making pancakes from scratch, right? It's only 6 ingredients. We don't need to buy the bag and add water from Costco. We're going to make it from scratch. It's way better. Okay, so I get the recipe and I unpack the recipe, right? So whenever I'm making a recipe, I unpack the recipe and I figure out what ingredients are necessary to make the meal. So a basic pancake recipe would be 2.5 cups of flour, 4 tablespoons of sugar, 4 teaspoons of baking powder, it'd be 2 eggs, 2 cups of milk, and a teaspoon of vanilla. So that's a basic recipe. So now, once you have those ingredients on the counter, it's sometimes tempting to look at that and say, okay, you've got your flour, you've got your eggs, you've got your sugar, you've got your baking powder. I've got all the ingredients on the counter. There, I've made pancakes. But of course, someone would look at that and say, well, you haven't made anything, that you have the ingredients necessary to make the meal. So what I'm getting at there is that sometimes we look at unpacking standards or unpacking outcomes, and yet we forget to repack them for somewhat of assessment, putting the ingredients back together. So now the middle step with baking, pancakes are technically baking, where you have to follow chemistry, right? So cooking, you cook to taste, you can add this, that. So first of all, then I've got my bowl of wet ingredients and I've got my bowl of dry ingredients. That is always the middle step in baking. Now I'm getting closer to making pancakes, but I have yet to make pancakes. But I need to teach my students about wet and dry ingredients. I need to teach them flour. I need to make sure they know they need flour. They have enough flour, enough sugar. So it's trying to get to the idea that you're going to teach it, you're going to assess it, but you're not going to score it. You're not going to grade it, right? So then finally we get to the point where they put all the ingredients together and they make the meal. And I'm going through this a little more quickly than I would in a workshop. I'd be a little bit more dramatic and a little bit more drawn out.
It's pretty dramatic. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not that dramatic. Yeah. So now we put all the ingredients together and I've got my batter, and now I make you pancakes. Okay. And I serve you my pancakes, and you might, so I'm holding up 4 fingers. I might serve you my pancakes and you say to me, Tom, these pancakes are exemplary. They are phenomenal. Everything about them not only shows competence, but it shows a level of finesse. It shows a refined kind of technique. Or I might serve you the pancakes. I'm holding up 3 fingers now. They're good pancakes, Tom. There's nothing about them that needs improving. Clinically, everything about them is solid, competent, proficient. They're good pancakes. There's nothing wrong with them. Not quite the level of finesse, but there's nothing wanting about them. Or holding up 2 fingers, I serve you my pancakes and you say to me, Tom, these pancakes, they have some aspects that are strong. I love the symmetry. I love the coloring that tells me you had the pan or the griddle at the right temperature. But they are a little flat. They're not as fluffy as we wanted as far as what we set out to do. So they're partway there. Or I hold up 1 finger and I say, I serve you the pancakes, and by every metric, they are minimally acceptable. It is pancakes, but almost every aspect needs some level of improvement, right? So what I'm trying to get at with that last part is making sure that people understand the difference between a learning progression and a rubric. So with the analogy of going from ingredients to the meal, what I'm trying to get across to people is this is a learning progression. As we go from the individual ingredients to combining some of the ingredients to making the meal, that's the cognitive rigor changing. And that's sort of moving through the taxonomy and sort of giving people a sense of how things get put back together. But when I assess you, when I summatively assess or judge the quality of your pancakes, all 4 levels are about making pancakes, right? It's making pancakes, making pancakes, making pancakes, making pancakes. What I do not say is you get a 1 because you have flour. You get a 2 because you have wet and dry ingredients. You get a 3 because you made pancakes, and you get a 4 because you went above and beyond and decided to add blueberries and whipped cream. So the 1 is the difference between a learning progression and 1 is a rubric. So what I'm trying to get at there is the idea of assessment planning alongside the unit planning of how important it is to repack the standards and really get to the appropriate cognitive rigor. Okay, that essentially is the pancake analogy. There's a lot of layers to it. So then subsequently to that, Nat, what I would do throughout the workshop is I would come back and say, okay, so why don't we assess this evidence, right? And I say, it's not pancakes. So so I get known as the pancake guy, I suppose. But I do, and I'll finish with this. I leave everyone with a mantra that I know they will never forget. 2 things they will never forget. 1 is every time they make pancakes, they're going to think of me.
Okay.
And 2, more importantly, I leave them with the mantra, stop grating flour.
I would argue raw egg. Every time someone tries, next time anyone tries to put a grade on formative evidence, I'll say, do you enjoy drinking raw eggs? That'll be my way of building on your analogy.
That's a good idea. I like that one too. But that's a mantra that I think can help people remind themselves of that. Anyway,
it's really helpful. It's funny. We didn't plan this ahead of time, but one of the first times I was doing a workshop on proficiency skills, I used craft dinner.
Okay.
So we came up with, because it was in, my context. So we used examples of all my different colleagues making craft dinner, and we wrote these whole narratives, and we had funny ones like, so-and-so's partner is so forgetful when they're following the craft dinner recipe, and they always forget to add the butter. So when their back is turned, you walk into the room and you add the butter when they're not looking. Assess the resulting evidence. And we made it we got some really juicy ones too, where we're like, you're traveling in a different country and you really want to make craft dinner. So you have to use your interpreter on your phone to be able to read the instructions again, but it's a perfect clinical bowl of craft dinner. Is that proficient? So we were just getting the conversation going, but again, using the analogy of let
me just pause you right there for a second, Matt. For our American listeners, just so you know, craft dinner is essentially Kraft as a brand. It is out of the box macaroni and cheese, just in case.
It's not in the States.
The American listeners might not understand what they have craft dinner, but I don't think they call it craft dinner. So I just wanted to make sure some So I want to make sure that some of our listeners understand some of our Canadianisms. How's it going? All right.
All right. Good job, bud. Thanks.
All right. So keep going. Analogies.
Oh, okay. Analogies. Mine are not nearly as in depth as yours. You really set the bar high. In retrospect, I probably should have gone first, but this is an analogy I've been using a lot lately, and perhaps it'll resonate with you, that when you start to explore assessment and specifically sound and equitable assessment practices, it's like pulling the loose thread on a sweater, because though you think you're just trying to figure out how to give better feedback, it starts to quickly unravel everything else that you've assumed to be a fundamental part of your practice. Like for me, coming from special education, I was always a little hesitant to move towards project-based learning. I was like, I think that's too complex. It's too much. And, some limiting beliefs that I had early on. And then as I got better and better at understanding assessment, I was like, we don't need courses. We don't need these silos. Things could be integrated. Oh, wait a minute. We're looking at evidence for collaboration in these 4 contexts. Why are we doing it in these different 4 silos? And then before you know it, everything just truly does start to unravel, where the possibilities are endless for how you can design learning experiences when you're actually looking at gathering evidence of the learning standards rather than tasks.
I think that's a good one, actually, because it is true that I think what happens is, it's cliche. A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. As you start to pull on the thread of assessment, you start to realize that there's a lot more. It is both simple and complex. It's simple because we have a pretty clear research and best practices that tell us what the most favorable action is when it comes to assessment. But there are nuances that make it challenging. And I like that idea, because once you pull on that thread of feedback and you start going down the feedback rabbit hole, then you think to yourself, well, to set myself up to provide more in-depth feedback or more specific feedback that causes thinking rather than giving just a set of directions, I need to be able to elicit evidence that allows me to do that. So that gets into assessment architecture, right? And then in the bigger picture, we say things like, if you get into architecture and assessing formatively to elicit that feedback to give students next steps in learning, why would you undermine all of that from your grading practices? In the end, you've gone through all of that work, and now at the 11th hour, you're annoyed because they handed you something a day after you wanted it, and you completely distort their achievement level. So I like that idea of pulling on the thread, because you think you're just going down the feedback rabbit hole, and suddenly you're holding a bowl of a ball of yarn, and the sweater's gone, right?
Yeah. A big one for me too that unraveled was, I was like, okay, well, if my feedback needs to elicit thinking, it's probably best delivered through dialogue, so I can really understand where they're at and make sure that we're on the same page. But how do I meet with all my students one-on-one? Okay, well, I should probably think about more of a blended learning approach, so that I can have, and then blended learning, they're all at different places. So how do I have them move on to the next thing if they finish one task? Well, I should probably figure out different levels of complexity so that they can move as far as they can while I can continue conferencing one-on-one with students. It really does start to, like, you can't pick one area of assessment without naturally progressing into all of the other ones. Doesn't matter where you start, you'll fall into them all.
That's for sure. And that's when Cassandra, Nicole, and I talk about our 6 tenets of assessment. We often make sure people understand that each of those 6 tenets is dependent upon the other 5. They lean on each other. And so we have to always remember the advice our mothers gave us, which was, don't pull on that thread. Don't pull on that thread unless you're prepared to follow through. Otherwise,
but it's a wonderful journey. It's a wonderful rabbit hole.
It is a wonderful journey for sure. And I do love that analogy, because I think it really does tell you that it isn't just as simple as tugging on it. You really have to be prepared to, in stages. I don't want to overwhelm people, but in stages, you've got to be prepared to reconsider a lot of what you might be doing around assessment. Other analogies?
Yeah, I actually, so these 2 are inspired by others. I've been on a quest to learn a lot more about portfolios the past year. And they're 2 analogies essentially of what not to do, but they really stuck with me. The first one came from Katie White in the interview we had. She said, portfolios should not be a scrapbook. And she went on to explain that you don't want this to be a place where everything that you could possibly gather gets dumped. So it just becomes a scrapbook with like, oh, here is the bottom of the receipt from that restaurant that one time that we were on the pier. That doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Right. So that's the one extreme. And then the other extreme, someone I was talking to a couple of days ago said, you don't want portfolios to become the refrigerator. And I was like, it's got delicious food in it. What do you mean by that? And he was like, no, it's where all the best work goes. It's where the A+ test goes. He's like, a portfolio should show work in progress. It should document failures. It should have some messiness to it. So for me, I'm like, the perfect analogy of what makes for a portfolio is somewhere between a scrapbook and a refrigerator. I don't know what that is, but I'll figure out what that analogy is. There's something in
I like
there.
that. There is something in there for sure. I think portfolios are a really interesting idea because, where I might deviate slightly in the thinking is that a portfolio can be whatever you want it to be. My issue with portfolios is when we say it's one thing and then it becomes another. If you want the portfolio to just be a scrapbook and be show and tell, then that's fine. If you want a program like Fresh Grade or Seesaw, if you want that to just be here's the highlight reel, here's the Sports Center, let's just show you the highlights, then do that. What happens is sometimes we say this is a portfolio to show growth, and yet we treat it like a scrapbook. And that's where we get into trouble, right? So if we want it to be a growth, we have to decide what the purpose of the portfolio is, because if it's a growth portfolio, for example, then I want early evidence, middle evidence, and late evidence. If it's an assessment or an achievement portfolio, then I want an array of samples where I would take some of that early evidence out of the portfolio because I would want an adequate sampling of my learning. If it's meant to be show and tell, that's fine. If it's meant to be, again, so for me, the issue with portfolios is when we say it's one thing, but we execute it in another way. That's where we really, and I agree. I don't disagree with their assertions around the scrapbook or the refrigerator, but I think the beginning of the portfolio is deciding what do you want, what purpose do you want the portfolio to serve, and then fulfill that mission and make sure that you keep a lid on what goes in the portfolio, either electronically or physically, because then you'll actually fulfill the purpose of what you're trying to say.
Saying one thing and doing another, that never happens in education,
Rarely,
though, other than
no,
portfolios.
Never.
One last thing I want to say about digital portfolios. It was actually, I was reading your new book about frequently asked questions, plug. And digital portfolios, let's throw that word in front of it. I think the greatest purpose right now for portfolios, if we want to go there, is filling that space between the summative evidence. To circle back to the pancake analogy, the biggest problem I run into is once you say, okay, let's just grade summative, you have less numbers going into the grade book, because if you're using a platform like PowerSchool and a lot of the other ones, if you make it exempt or not counting towards the final grade, it doesn't show it to parents. So we need something in the interim to say, hey, this is all the great stuff we're doing. And I think that's where, if it's used for the purpose of communication on an ongoing basis to avoid the need for constant grading, that is a great use of portfolios. I
think that I love that. And I think maybe something we pick up on for next time is this conversation around, that the portfolio or evidence or wherever. We'll figure out where we're going to go. But what I love about that is that when you have fewer entries into your grade book in a traditional sense, like there's fewer scores in the grade book, we're talking about quality, not quantity. But when it comes to quality, fewer numbers does not really relay quality. So being able to provide tangible evidence or visual evidence and criteria, that's the other part maybe to pick up on for next time, is that sometimes we say the portfolio is one thing, but then parents don't know how to consume it. And they don't know what the criteria is. They don't really know what they're looking at. And therefore, that's how it regresses into show and tell. And a parent might say to themselves, yeah, that's great. Okay. Yeah. That's a nice castle or a volcano or whatever you did. And, but they don't really know why it's excellent. So maybe we'll pick up on that next time, or maybe we'll go in a different direction. We'll give that some thought, but again, our time is up. Nat, thanks for being here this week.
Time flies when you're having fun, Tom.
Okay, that's it for this week. Remember to follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Also, please email the podcast, tomshimmerpod@gmail.com. If you've got questions for Natalie and I on Assess That, or if you have any suggestions or feedback for me about the podcast. And a reminder to check the show notes for the links for the upcoming professional learning events happening this summer, but also into the fall. The next episode will be Monday, July 18th. That'll be in 2 weeks, where my guest will be Goldie Mohammed, who is the author of the book Cultivating Genius, an Equity Framework for Culturally and Historically Responsive Literacy. Now, full disclosure, we've already recorded that interview ahead of time, and I promise you, you are not going to want to miss that. Please subscribe, rate, review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts, of course, but a rating or review on any platform will help grow the podcast's reach. And of course, if you like what you hear, please keep spreading the word about the podcast to your friends, your colleagues, or on social media. I would really appreciate that. Happy summer, everyone.